There we go. That's better, huh? All right. No frozen? Okay, good. All right. What I was going to tell you is that I'm doing 6, 7, and 8, and it might seem like a lot, but there's not a lot going on. Believe it or not, in these 3 chapters, nobody dies. I know, right? Go figure. So this is the big temple reveal. We're going to see Solomon creating the temple, building the temple in chapter 6. And in chapter 7, he starts to work with the temple, and you can see all this. Nobody's even talking. And then chapter 7, it's more building and describing how big things are and other stuff. And I'll go through this in a second just to show you. And so we can hit some highlights. And then chapter 8 is finally the dedication. Boy, since there's nobody talking, they make up for it because Solomon does all these prayers to God, all this green, and telling and proclaiming greatness to God. And they're all broken down in sections too. We'll kind of hit those a little bit. And then there's a little bit at the end, and that's about it. And I think it actually goes all the way to verse 10 in chapter 9, but we're not gonna worry about that. So what we're gonna do first is just kind of read through some of these spots in chapter 6. I got a picture over here I want to show you, just kind of give you an idea. But the thing about the temple itself, the descriptions that we see in Scripture, they're not real strong descriptions. And so if you ever see pictures of them that people tried to recreate, they're guesswork at best, that kind of thing. So my little notation here kind of gives you a setup on what we're looking at in chapter 6, about how the central units of Solomon's story describing the building of the temple and its dedication ceremony, which is chapters 8 to 9, 10. It talks about approaching from a distance. We see the ground plans and then structural work in stone and then in wood. After a brief interruption, that it recounts the divine word to Solomon. And then it goes back. We enter the temple to view the paneling, ornamentation of the nave, all these holy of holies, all this kind of stuff. And that's what we're going to kind of look at as far as going through all this part. And then chapter 7 breaks some of the stuff that goes on outside and the like. But you realize too that Solomon not only built a temple for God, he also built his own home. David had a home he built, but Solomon built a bigger home. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So it says here, in the 480th year after the Israelites went forth from the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel. So it's only his 4th year, and so he was crowned relatively young. So he's still a young guy when all this is going on. And this is the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month. That's basically I believe a Canaanite calendar. I don't know if it tells us in here or not. I didn't think to look for this one. What this is telling us is that basically where they're building the temple is in between 2 basic points in Scripture. The temple was built approximately midway between Israel's 2 foundational deliverances, the Exodus and the return from Babylonian exile. So it says here, these figures recommend caution in using them for historical reconstruction. In other words, it might not have been exactly halfway through, but it was in between the 2. Okay. So it says here in verse 2, the house which King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 wide, and 30 high. Now, I've said it quite a few times. For the most part, a cubit is basically from the fingertip to the elbow, or what people would just kind of round out to be about 18 inches. And so it's 1.5 feet. So if you're looking at, of course, 60 cubits, you're looking at 90 feet. And then 20 wide is 30 feet, and then 30 high would be 45 feet. My great math skills come in handy sometimes. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how big the building is. So the house which King Solomon built for the Lord, which is the temple, was 90 feet long from the front door to the back. And if you think about 90 feet, put 90 feet on a football field. A football field is 300 feet. And so this is less than 1/3 the length of a football field from end zone to end zone, which means it's really not as big as you might really think it is. And some other statistics here. It talks about the porch area, the outside by the nave was, I'm just going to use feet just to help us out a little bit. It was 30 feet from side to side along the width of the house, and 15 feet deep in the front of the house. It's kind of like a little, what would you call it? Like our narthex, a little opening area, if you will. The windows were closed lattices, were made for the house itself. Some people put them up real high, and they let in a little bit of light, but you can't really just, it's not an open window. Adjoining the wall of the house, he built a substructure around its walls that enclosed the nave and the inner sanctuary. Excuse me. He made side chambers and, wait a second, I just thought of something. Hold on a second. I don't think I ever hit record on this. Come here. And I'm getting in trouble again if I don't. Stop. Oh, no, it is recording. Okay, good. Woo! All right. I'm such a classic tech kind of guy. So he made the side chambers around. The lowest story was 5 cubits wide. The middle one, 6 cubits wide. The third, 7 cubits wide. But I'm going to show you a picture in a minute. It's going to help a lot, at least from what they could tell from all this. He put recesses along the outside of the house to avoid fastening anything into the walls of the house. The house, and it says house, we're talking about the temple, the house of the Lord, okay? The house was built of stone dressed at the quarry so that no hammer or axe, no iron tool was to be heard in the house during its construction. So while they're building this, to keep the noise down, they went to the rock quarry and they built all the stones and then moved the stones for construction. The entrance to the middle story was on the south side of the house. Stairs led up to the middle story and from the middle story to the third. So in other words, you kind of go up steps and then you get into the holy place, and you go up more steps to get into the holy of holy places. When they finished building the house, it was roofed with rafters and board of cedar. He built a substructure 7.5 feet high all along the outside of the house, which it was joined by cedar beams. Because remember, we talked about Hiram from Tyre last week, who donated all that wood. And so that's where he's getting all this cedar wood and everything else. And we're going to see a little bit about him in just a minute again. But we have a little pause here, because the word of the Lord came to Solomon. And God told Solomon, as to this house you are building, if you walk in my statutes, carry out my ordinances, and observe all my commands, walking in them, I will fulfill toward you my word, which I spoke to David your father. I will dwell in the midst of the Israelites and will not forsake my people. This is a promise that God we've seen over and over again, especially lately with David, and then Solomon even had this mentioned to him before. In a sense, when he asked for what he wanted, and of course he got his wisdom, and he said, I'll give you a long life if you continue to follow these statutes. So now we go back to Solomon finished building the house of the Lord. So its walls were lined with cedar paneling. He covered the interior with wood from floor to ceiling, and he covered its floor with fir planking. And fir tree is basically kind of like a pine tree, if you will, here. At the rear of the house, a space of 20 cubits or 30 feet was set off by cedar panels from the floor to the ceiling, enclosing the inner sanctuary, or the Holy of Holies. So that's the rear part where the Holy of Holies is. And let's see, the house was 60 cubits long. That is the nave, the part in the front. The cedar, and so this is the different sections, the 1, 2, and 3, if you will. The house was 60 cubits long. That is the nave. Okay. The cedar in the interior of the house was carved in the form of gourds and open flowers. All was of cedar, and no stone was to be seen. So, of course, stone made this whole temple, but inside they paneled it. Not the stuff that we used in the old 60s and 70s, but they used paneling. It was cedar wood. So, and again, cedar is not I think that was a good wood also to keep moisture out and everything else. And I guess it was a pretty wood as well. And the innermost part of the house, he set up the inner sanctuary to house the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, so this is the Holy of Holies. In front of the inner sanctuary, it was 30 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 30 feet high, and it was covered with pure gold. So it's basically like a box. He made an altar of cedar. Solomon covered the interior of the house with pure gold, and he drew golden chains across in front of the inner sanctuary and covered it with gold as well. Let me scroll up. He covered the whole house with gold until the whole house was done, and the whole altar that belonged to the inner sanctuary he covered with gold. So in the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubims, each 15 feet high, which is pretty good. That's about the height of your single-story house, roughly, made of pine. Each wing of the cherubim was 7.5 feet, so that the span was wingtip to wingtip, 15 feet. So these are pretty large, and what they're doing is covering the ark, actually, if you will. So the second cherub was also 10 cubits. I'm sorry, it was 15 feet, and the two cherubim were identical in size and shape. And the first cherub was 15 feet high, and so was the second. So we get an image of that. He placed the cherubim in the inmost part of the house. The wings of the cherubim were spread wide, so that one wing of the first touched the side wall. So they're lined up like this, touching the side wall, facing this way, and then touching each other, and then touching the other side of the house, of the wall. Other wing wall, I'll show you a picture in a minute. The wings pointing to the middle of the room touched each other. He overlaid the cherubim with gold. So we always talk about Solomon's gold. Well, if he had any, he ended up using it all for his house and for the temple. So the walls on all sides of both the inner and outer rooms had carved figures of cherubims, palm trees, and open flowers. The floor of the house of both the inner and outer rooms were overlaid with gold. At the entrance of the inner sanctuary, doors of pine were made. This is the entrance into the inner sanctuary. There were doors. I was actually looking around a little bit on the internet, and I saw a video that was like reconstructed. And inside they had put doors into the inner sanctuary. And, you know, people put comments at the bottom, and someone said, well, and some people didn't like the video, how it was done, and said, this is wrong, this is wrong. And one person goes, and there's no doors there at the inner and the Holy of Holies. It's a curtain because it tore when Jesus, you know, was on the cross and died. Well, yes, that's true. But again, that's not the temple. This temple was no longer around at the time of Jesus. It was gone. It was Herod's temple that was actually built at the time, and it did have a curtain instead of doors. But this one has got doors. The doors were overlaid with gold, of course. And the cherubim and palm trees were also covered with beaten gold. So it's probably like, you know, just the thin gold that you can work with and everything else. He did the same on the entrance to the nave, where the doorposts were of pine and were four-sided. So it was a square column, if you will. The two doors were of fir wood. Each door consisted of two panels hinged together. And he carved cherubim, palm trees, open flowers, and plated them with gold. He walled off the inner court with 3 courses of hewn stone and 1 course of cedar beams. Hewn just means it's just basically been a stone that's been carved, if you will, sculpted to be that nice shape. And then the last part of chapter 6 says the foundations of the Lord's house were laid in the month of Ziv in the 4th year, and it was finished in all particulars exactly according to plan in the month of Bul, the 8th month in the 11th year. Thus Solomon built it in 7 years, and that's something that we're gonna see. It is interesting that it is actually 7 years, because the number 7 a lot of times can be complete or good, you know, that kind of thing. So it's interesting that this temple of God would actually be built within 7 years. So show you a quick pic if it'll come up. Oh, don't give me trouble. That is not the picture I wanted. Hold on. Here it is. If you look, this is Solomon's temple that we're talking about. And it's 90 feet. If you can see my hand on the screen, this is 90 feet. And then 60 feet, I think 30 feet high. And we'll talk about these other items here in just a little bit in chapter 7. But just to give you an idea, this is the temple that Herod built. Actually much larger than what Solomon built. And so we don't see this one built though until much later. I think it says here Solomon's temple, finished in 957 BC, was less than 1/2 the size of Herod the Great's expanded second temple in Jerusalem, built only about 20 years before Christ was born. So this is also the same Herod, I imagine, who was looking for Christ to be killed and talk to the 3 wise men and all that kind of stuff. So we're not really doing this one. What we're worrying about is this one here. So just kind of give you a picture. I don't know if this will come up or not. Not the picture I was looking for. And of course, the computer's slow. If I type in Solomon's temple, there's a picture. Here we go. Okay. I'm not really crazy about this one, but this is like where you walk in, because they did a cutaway. but you would walk in this way, and then this is like that little narthex or nave, and then they had the doors here, and then you had the lampstands. A lot of them will show you lampstands as menorahs that you would see, and God commanded to be built. So they didn't put that in theirs. And then way over here, of course, would be possibly, there's the incense, and then this would be the Holy of Holies, and this is like the cherubims way back in there. And there's some other descriptions of having these other rooms next to it to hold items and the like. And then I thought there was another picture, maybe not. Hold on. Okay, so this is another outside view. We're going to talk about these 5 containers of water, which is 5 on each side, 1 here and 5 over here. And we'll also talk about this being built and why it's got these little animals holding them up with their backside, that kind of thing. Again, this is about 90 feet. So this is a football field. The football field would stretch way down here. And I think that's about it. Yeah, that's it. Okay. So at least you can get at least an idea what the temple might look like. All right. So let's go to chapter 7. And there's a little notation here I wanted to show you all as well. The account of Solomon's building of the temple, the Lord's house, is interrupted by an account of his building of the palace, Solomon's house, which contained also the main buildings of public administration. So we have the building of the temple, and then it's going to talk about him building his house, and it's going to go back to the temple. The passage is anachronistic, since these sections in 9 imply that the palace was not begun until the temple was completed. By placing the account here, the narrator highlights the fact that Solomon spent almost twice as long on his own house as the Lord's. And it's going to tell us, I think he spent about 13 years building his house, but only took him 7 to do the Lord's. I'm not sure that means his house is bigger or not, or what the case is, but anyways. So to finish the building of the house, Solomon took 13 years. He built the house of the there it is. And the house of the forest of Lebanon, 100 cubits long. Yeah, that's 150 feet long. So that's way, that's 60 feet more than the temple. 75 feet wide and 45 feet high. So his home is much bigger than the temple itself. It was supported by 4 rows of cedar columns, cedar beams upon the columns, ceiling of cedar upon the rafters. These rafters numbered 45, 15 in a row, all these little descriptions. Lattice work, let's see, openings, doorposts, squared lintels. Lintels that like the lintel over a doorway, kind of like you might see behind me, you know, the door and how it's got a door frame. A lintel would be something that's kind of lining the door, and the top of the door, actually. Each facing across the next. He also made the porch of columns 75 feet long and 45 feet wide. So he did a great job in his own house. Porch extended across the front. Let's see what else might be in here. He also made the porch of the throne where he gave judgment. I guess an area to where he could have receive all these people wanting questions answered and the like. And let's see, paneled it with cedar from floor to ceiling. The house in which he lived was in another court. So where he lived and then where the temple was in different places. Set in deeper than the porch of the same construction. So Solomon made a house like this porch for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he married. It's just a little notation, because again, this could have easily been written 500 years after this time that this occurred. And so it's just basically telling us that Solomon did not build the house for Pharaoh's daughter until temple and palace were finished. But by mentioning this marriage, the narrator keeps before the reader a developing theme in the Solomon story, the king's building activities for his 4 foreign wives, which eventually implicate him in idolatry, because that's what he does. And of course, the tribes all separate and everything else, which will occur later on in this book. So all these buildings were of fine stones, and they're all, again, trimmed and cut a certain way and all that kind of stuff. And it says the foundation was made of fine, large blocks, some 15 feet and some 12 feet. Above these fine stones to size and cedar wood, the great court had 3 courses of hewn stones all about with the cedar beams. Just more descriptions, really. And you can get lost in all this stuff. So here we go. King Solomon brought Hiram, and we already mentioned him in chapter 5 because he's the one that can do all the great bronze work. He also brought the trees down from Tyre and all that kind of stuff. He also he's always had a wonderful relationship with Solomon and his dad, King David, and he wanted to keep that. And also remember too that last week we talked about how Solomon asked him that he would send some of his people up there to help acquire some of these goods, and Hiram goes, "No, I'm good. I'll send it back to you, and of course you can give me this." And it was a really good deal for Hiram because he got a great amount of booty, if you will, from all the stuff that King Solomon gave him to do this. So he was a bronze worker and the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali. His father had been from Tyre. He was endowed with wisdom, understanding, and knowledge for doing any work in bronze. He came to King Solomon and did all his metal work. Let me see something. I'm curious now if, I think it's the same Hiram, but now I kind of wonder. All of a sudden something just kind of hits you. The king of Tyre, friend of David's, in particular David's palace and Solomon's temple. He also assisted Solomon's effort to bleed. Okay, yeah, same guy. All right, just making sure. So he fashioned 2 bronze columns, both 18 cubits. Let's see, carry the 9. It'd be 27 feet and 18 cubics and 18 feet in circumference. He also made 2 capitals cast in bronze to be placed on the top of the columns, each of them 7.5 feet high. A capital is something that you basically put on top of the column as a decorative piece, like maybe the leaves, coming over or whatever you want to put on it. So that's what those are. And then they put mesh made from netting and braided in like chains for the capitals on top of the columns, 7 for each capital. He also cast pomegranates, 2 rows around each netting to cover the capital on top of the columns. The capitals on top of the columns in the porch were made like lilies, like I was saying earlier, are 6 feet high, which is already sitting on top of a very tall capital. And the capitals on the 2 columns, both above and adjoining the bulge where it crossed out of the netting, had 200 pomegranates in rows around each capital. I don't have a picture of those. I didn't look up his house. So he set up the columns at the temple porch. One he set up to the south and called it, this is really interesting, and scholars aren't sure why and the purpose of it, but the 2 columns were named. One was called Jachin, and the other to the north was called Boaz. And so if we put a thing on here, it does give us a description of what the word might mean. If you look right here, it says, from he or it will establish the name of 3 Israels and of a temple pillar. So it's a name that's actually used, but here the name actually means or it will establish. So I thought maybe Boaz meant temple, will establish a temple, but that's not actually what Boaz means. Boaz actually just basically means from an unused root word, from an unused root of uncertainty meaning. So they're not quite sure. Anyways, they're perplexed. And if they're perplexed, I'm perplexed. All right. Then he made the molten sea, as it's called. The molten sea was, let's see if I can show you. Molten sea was this big pot right here. I was wondering if I had a better picture here, if it wants to come up. Ah, lordy, must be over here. This right here, they call it the molten sea, where they would wash and the like. And I don't think there's another picture of it. That's probably all I have right now. And let's see. Okay. It was made with a circular rim, as you can see, and measured 15 feet across, 7.5 feet in height, and 45 feet in circumference, which is about right if it measures 10 feet across and you do your math from diameter to circumference and add in, do some pi work, 3.1419. Under the brim, gourds enclosed it to 15 feet around the compass of the sea. The gourds were in 2 rows and were cast in 1 mold with the sea. That's all this bronze work. This rested on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, and 3 facing south, and 3 facing east, with their haunches all toward the center, means their backsides. And upon them was set the sea. So this pot sits on the back side of all these oxen, 3 facing each way. It was a handbreadth thick, and its brim resembled that of a cup. So it would kind of come up and then kind of softly over the edge kind of thing. Its capacity was 2,000 baths. A bath, we saw somewhere else, was basically 12 gallons of water. So this thing could hold about 24,000 gallons of water. So it's pretty huge. All right. He also made 10 stands of bronze, each 6 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 4.5 feet high. If these stands were constructed, panels were set within the framework. These are the ones that I was just showing you a second ago. These smaller ones right here is what they're talking about. Okay. When these stands were constructed, on the panels within the frames were lions, oxen, and cherubim. And it goes on to say each stand had 4 bronze wheels and bronze axles. The 4 legs of each stand had cast braces, which were under the basin, and they had reeves on each side. The mouth of the basin was inside, and a cubit above the crown, whose opening was round and made like a receptacle, and a cubit and a half or 2¼ feet deep. So it's not real deep, past your kneecap, I guess. But these are carts for carrying some of this water. Not a whole lot of excitement going on today, I can tell you. And so the 4 wheels were below the panels and axle trees. Other wheels and the stands were of 1 piece. Each wheel was a cubit and a half high. So basically, another size of the, 2¼ feet high. Wheels were constructed like chariot wheels, rims and spokes, hubs were all cast. The 4 braces reached the 4 corners of the stand. Well, wow, just kind of makes your brain just kind of go numb reading all these descriptions. Where there was a bare space, cherubim, lions, and palm trees were carved, as well as wreaths around all of them. This was how he made the 10 stands of the same casting, same size, and same shape. And he made 10 bronze basins, which I just described, each 6 feet in diameter, with a capacity of 40 baths, which would be what, 480 gallons of water. 40 times 12, yeah. And 1 basin atop each of the 10 stands. So he placed the stands 5 on the south side of the house and 5 on the north. And the molten sea, he placed off to the southeast from the south side of the house. So that's basically what they're telling you. This is the southeast side, this is the south, and this is the north up here. And of course, the temple faces the east. Interesting, huh? Okay. Going forth from all this excitement today, let's see what else is going on. When Hiram had placed the pots and shovels and bowls and all the other equipment that's needed, he finished all his work for King Solomon in the house of the Lord. And it just kind of went on to talk about more columns, netting, pomegranates, shapes is what that is, capitals on top of the columns, the 10 stands, 10. This is just recounting what we already described. This is all the things that we just read about, all summarized right here. And so then he says, all these articles which Hiram made for King Solomon in the house of the Lord were of burnished bronze. The king had them cast in the neighborhood of the Jordan, between Sukkoth and Zarethan, in the thick clay molds. So this was made somewhere else when he made the molds and everything else and then brought them in. Solomon did not weigh all the articles because they were so numerous. The weight of the bronze, therefore, was not determined. So it's just funny how these stories got passed down for so long and still kept together. So the end of chapter 7 says, Solomon made all the articles that were for the house of the Lord, the golden altar, the table on which the showbread lay. Because if you remember now, the tent has these things in it. Has that menorah, it had the showbread tray, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 to the right, 5 to the left before the inner sanctuary, flower lamps and tongs of gold, basins, snuffers, bowls, cups, fire pans, all made of pure gold. Hinges of gold for the doors, the innermost part of the house, are holy of holies, and for the doors of the outer room, the nave. When all the work undertaken by King Solomon in the house of the Lord was completed, he brought to the votive offerings of his father David and put the silver, gold, and other articles in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. So he took some of those items that were of David's that he wanted to let be part of the temple, since David could not build a temple. Woo! Okay, now we're going to go ahead and do chapter 8. And now we're going to go from nobody talking to a lot of talking. So we got to dedicate the temple. So then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel, and at this point he means all of Israel, not just the northern Israel area, and of all the heads of the tribes, the princes, and the ancestral houses of the Israelites. They came to King Solomon in Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the Lord, covenant from the city of David, because they haven't put the ark in, so it's going to be a big party. It's going to be a big celebration, taking the ark of the covenant out of the tent, which has been there for like extremely long time, since the time of Moses, and now they're going to finally put it into the temple that God said that he would finally allow them to build. And it goes on, all the people of Israel assembled before King Solomon during the festival in the month of Ithanim. Now, Ithanim is a Canaanite month, actually. It's interesting that they're using it here. It's the 7th month, and it's usually around this time. And so the great festival at that time, and here's the thing, it's talking about the festival. It's not a new festival that's going on, but this is the festival they already had of the Feast of Booths, or Sukkoth. We can see that in Leviticus. So it's been established since the time of Moses. And the feast was important enough, I like this part, the feast was important enough to warrant holding the dedication ceremony either a month before or 11 months after the temple was completed in the 8th month. In other words, everybody's coming in for this Feast of Booths anyways. Let's go ahead and have it while everybody's already here. So good planning. And it makes everybody not to make 2 trips, because some people do come quite a ways, especially when you're walking on foot. So when all the elders of Israel had arrived, the priests took up the ark, and they brought up the ark of the Lord in the tent of meeting with all the sacred vessels that were in the tent. The priests and Levites brought them up because that's their job. The Levites, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, is what makes up the priestly nation. Okay. And so King Solomon and the entire community of Israel gathered for the occasion before the ark. They sacrificed sheep and oxen, too many to number or count, because you know how we always have that exaggerative breathing inside these scriptures about what's going on. So the priests brought the Ark of the Covenant to the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, the Holy of Holies, beneath the wings of the cherubim that we described and we saw earlier in the picture. The cherubim had their wings spread out all over the place of the ark, sheltering the ark and its poles from above. The poles is what they would use to lift it and to move it, because you do not touch the ark. Ask Onan that. Zip, you don't want it to happen. So that's why they had the poles. And the poles are extremely long, which it says right here in verse 8. The poles were so long that their ends could be seen from the holy place, which is the middle section in front of the inner sanctuary, because you have a holy place, and then you have the holies of holies, and so you could see them stretching through. It cannot be seen from outside, though, but they remain there to this day. Which again, as you can see, this was written much time later. Let me scroll up a little bit. There was nothing in the ark but the 2 stone tablets which Moses had put there at Horeb, when the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites after they went forth from the land of Egypt. When the priest left the holy place, the cloud filled the house of the Lord, as it did back at the time of Moses when it was traveling. So the priest could no longer minister because of the cloud, since the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. And just as a side note as well, it's telling you what's inside the ark, and telling you that it's just the tablets, the 2 stone tablets that Moses put in there. There's more than that in the ark. So I'm not exactly sure at this point why it's saying that there's nothing in the ark but the stone tablets, that the other items have been removed, or if I missed something in the past, because it used to be Aaron's staff that blossomed almond flowers when there was a contest of his legitimacy as a priest. And the other item was manna. They actually kept a sampling of manna that was feeding the people traveling through the wilderness before they came to the promised land. I'm sure you remember that. And so here it just says the tablets. Now Solomon speaks. The Lord intends to dwell in the dark cloud, which he means that cloud that is on top of the temple. I have indeed built you a princely house, the base for your enthronement forever. Well, forever does come to an end sometimes. All right, so the king turned and blessed the whole assembly of Israel while the whole assembly of Israel stood. And it's kind of interesting to see a little bit of a mimicking or a foreshadowing of the Mass, of how he's performing this ceremony. And he says, bless the Lord. Okay, here we go. He says, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who was with his own mouth spoke a promise to David my father, and by his hand fulfilled it, saying, since the day I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I have not chosen a city out of any tribe of Israel for the building of a house, that my name might be there. But I have chosen David to rule my people Israel. He's reiterating the story of what occurred to all the people, in case somebody missed it. When David my father wished to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, the Lord said to him, in wishing to build a house for my name, you did well. So I see he's making his father sound good, because before it was just kind of like, you can build a house. I don't need a house, David. But now he makes it kind of sound like the Lord was saying to him, hey, you're doing really good to think about me and wanting to build a house, but don't. It says, but it is, in verse 19, but it is not you who will build the house, but your son who comes from your loins, he shall build the house for my name. Now the Lord has fulfilled the word he spoke. I have succeeded David my father, and I sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord has spoken, and I have built this house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. I provided there a place for the ark in which the covenant of the Lord that he made with our ancestors when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. So just a lot of rhetoric, if you will, explaining to everybody what's going on. Okay. Now he prays. So Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of the whole assembly of Israel, and stretching forth his hands toward heaven, he said, and more than likely he was standing on the same side of the altar, kind of like the old days of Mass, and then facing with the people with his arms stretched out and saying these prayers. And each one has a purpose, actually. So the first one says, Lord God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. You keep covenant and love toward your servants who walk before you with their whole hearts. The covenant that you have kept toward your servant David my father, what you promised him, your mouth has spoken and your hand has fulfilled this very day. And so he's worshiping, he's praising God. That's what this is. And now, Lord God of Israel, keep toward your servant David my father what you promised. There shall never be wanting someone from your line to sit before me on the throne of Israel, provided that your descendants keep to their way, walking before me as you have. Now, God of Israel, may the words you spoke to your servant David my father be confirmed. So he made a little blurb in there going, David kept your commandments, and I am too, and we're going to keep them from ever, ever, and ever, and ever. Well, it doesn't last very long, but that's okay. We'll see what happens next. And so on this one, he says, is God indeed to dwell on earth? If the heavens and the highest heavens cannot contain you, how much less this house will I have built? So he's recognizing the greatness of God. He's saying God doesn't actually fully dwell in this little 90 by 60 foot building. Regard kindly the prayer and petition of your servant, Lord my God, and listen to the cry of supplication which I, your servant, utter before you this day. May your eyes be open night and day toward this house, the place of which you said, my name shall be there. Listen to the prayer your servant makes toward this place. Listen to the petition of your servant and of your people Israel, which they offer toward this place. Listen from the place of your enthronement. Heaven, listen and forgive. So God, please listen to your people. Please listen. Please give us your mercy and forgiveness. That's what he's basically doing within this section here. Now with verse 31, he says, if someone sins in some way, and some of this is actually recalling the laws that came from Moses. You can see them in Leviticus and in some of the other books as well. If someone sins in some way against a neighbor and is required to take an oath sanctioned by a curse, and comes and takes the oath before your altar in this house, listen in heaven, act and judge your servants, condemn the wicked, requite their ways, acquit the just, and reward their justice. So in other words, help us to be a just people and make good, just judgments. And in verse 33, it says, when your people Israel are defeated by an enemy because they sinned against you, and they return to you, praise your name, praise to you, and entreat you in this house. Listen in heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel and bring back to the land you gave their ancestors. So in other words, if Israel are defeated by an enemy because they sinned, and this has already actually happened, then allow this to be forgiven and that we can return to you, which is also foreshadowing the fact of what happens in Babylon when they all get removed and then through the exile, and then they get to actually come back. Verse 35, when the heavens are closed so that there's no rain, in other words, when there's a drought, which happened at the time of Jacob, by the way, and Joseph, and he goes to Egypt, and that's why everybody moves over to Egypt because of a drought, because they have sinned against you, but they pray toward this place and praise your name. And think about that. But they pray toward this place, because not everybody's allowed, obviously, in the temple area. But you would face that way, just like you did at the time of Moses. You know, when they had all the 12 tribes of Israel, they were told exactly where to set up their tents. And in the middle of all that was the temple, the tent of meeting, and then the Ark of the Covenant and Holy of Holies. And when you prayed, you would pray towards that direction. So they're still honoring that, if you will. And the people now will still pray when they pray wherever they are in their homes and face that way. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? It says, listen in heaven and forgive the sin of your people, Israel, and bring them back to the land. Okay, I'm sorry. We're back right here with the rain. Let me scroll up. Maybe I won't do that. So when heavens are closed, do there no rain because they have sinned against you, but they pray toward this place and praise your name and turn from their sin because you have afflicted them. Listen in heaven and forgive the sin of your servants, your people Israel, for you teach them the good way in which they should walk. Give rain to this land of yours, which you have given to your people as a heritage. So in other words, apparently, if you close off the heavens from raining, we must have done something wrong. Listen to our prayers of forgiveness and allow us to again have rain. So these are all just little things that he's adding in here. Okay, we're getting there. Okay, whoops, 37. If there is famine in the land, or pestilence, or blight comes, or mildew, or locust, or caterpillars, or springtail bugs, if any enemy of your people presses upon them in the land and at their gates, whatever plague or sickness there may be, whatever prayer or petition any may make, any of your people Israel, who know heartfelt remorse and stretch out their hands toward this house, listen in heaven, the place of your enthronement, forgive and take action. Render to each and all according to their ways, you who know every heart. For it is you alone who know the heart of every human being. So may they revere you as long as they live on the land you gave our ancestors. So now he's saying, okay, if our enemies defeat us, or if we have no rain, or now if there's any pestilence or blight, it's our fault. Forgive us and let us move on. Okay, so verse 41. To the foreigners, likewise, who are not of your people Israel, but who come from a distant land for the sake of your name, because we do see quite a few stories about those who, even really close to David was one of them, that were not an Israelite people, but they will a great relationship with each other. From a distant land for the sake of your name, since people will hear of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm, when they come and pray toward this house, listen to heaven, in heaven, the place of your enthronement. Do all the place of your enthronement, of course, is the Holy of Holies. Do all that the foreigner asks of you, that all the people of the earth may know your name, may revere you as you do your people Israel, and may know that your name has been invoked upon this house that I have built. Which is also a lead in from the time of Jesus telling us that there's going to be a time for the Gentiles as well, because they're all God's people, actually. And so we even see that all the way back at the time of Solomon. And we saw a little bit at actually the time of David as well, and Joshua for that matter. So verse 44, when your people go out to war against their enemies, by whatever way you send them, and they pray to the Lord toward the city you have chosen and the house I have built for your name, listen in heaven to their prayers and petitions and uphold their cause. So if they go out to war for a good cause, let them be successful in it. Okay, this is 46. It's a little bit longer. When they sin against you, when the people sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin. And that's a good point, because nobody is actually excluded from ever sinning. Even Ecclesiastes 7:20, yet there is no one on earth who so just as to do good and never sin. And then, of course, in 1 John chapter 1, verse 8, if you say we are without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. We are actually seeing this out of Solomon's wisdom, that everybody basically is a sinner. And in your anger against them, you deliver them to the enemy, so that their captors carry them off to the land of the enemy far and near, which again happens with the Babylonian exile. And they have a change of heart in the land of their captivity, which actually happens. And this is probably written after the whole Babylonian exile. So there might be some influence of the writers when they were actually putting this together. And they turn and entreat you in the land of their captors and say, we have sinned and done wrong, we have been wicked. If with their whole heart and soul they turn back to you in the land of their enemies who took them captive, and prayed to you toward the land you gave their ancestors, the city you have chosen, and a house I have built for your name, listen in heaven, your dwelling place, to their prayer and petition, and uphold their cause. Forgive your people who have sinned against you and all their offenses that they have committed against you, and grant them mercy in the sight of your captors, so that these will be merciful to them. For they are your people and your heritage, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt from the midst of the iron furnace. Okay, so that's just basically saying, all right, so if this happens, which of course did, or will happen later, then please forgive the people, let them change of heart to go back to the ways of God. All right, we're getting close. Verse 52, thus may your eyes be open to the petition of your servant and to the petitions of your people Israel. Thus may you listen to them whenever they call upon you, for you have set them apart from all the peoples of the earth to be your heritage, as you declared through Moses your servant, when you brought our ancestors out of Egypt, Lord my God. Okay, so this is a little bit more proclaiming of what the greatness of God and having them come out of that. Now, after making all these pronouncements and prayers, Solomon finishes the offering of this entire prayer and petition to the Lord. He rose from before the altar of the Lord, where he was, probably on his knees, and where he had been kneeling. Oh, I'm sorry, there it is. Hands outstretched towards heaven. He stood and blessed the whole assembly, Israel, saying in a loud voice. So he has his hands stretched out toward heaven, but he stands and he faces the community, and then he says to them, blessed be the Lord who has given us rest to his people Israel, just as he promised. Not a single word has gone unfulfilled of the entire gracious promise he made through Moses, his servant. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our ancestors, and may he not forsake us nor cast us off. May he draw our hearts to himself, that we may walk in his ways and keep his commands, statutes, and ordinances that he enjoined on our ancestors. May these words of mine, the petition I have offered before the Lord our God, be present to the Lord our God day and night, that he may uphold the cause of his servants and the cause of his people Israel as each day requires, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God and there is no other. It's more praising, basically. Your heart must be wholly devoted to the Lord, and also inquiring with the people. Your heart must be wholly devoted to the Lord our God, observing his statutes and keeping his commands as on this day. And if you notice, it does say in here, say the Lord, where was it at? We walk in his ways. Okay, may the Lord our God be with us as he has with our ancestors, and may he not forsake us or cast us off. Okay, well, eventually the people lose the temple, they lose Ark of the Covenant, they get sent into a Babylonian exile. Northern Israel goes Assyrian Empire, which never to be heard from again, and all these things happen. But that does not mean that God ever cast off his people, because God always has a plan for his people and for all of his creation. And so people make their choices, but God will not deny who he is himself, and he will always be with his people, even if they are in these terrible situations. And I think that's important to remember as well. Okay, so rounding out chapter 8, which is 8:30, so this is good. The king and all Israel with him offered sacrifices before the Lord. Solomon offered as communion offerings, and a communion offering, I know Stacy asked this one time, I finally found it. Communion offering is like a peace offering. But when in communion, what would happen is that the priest would actually partake of the food itself with the individuals who would bring this offering, which usually wouldn't happen because this is a communion with the people and God. And that was the purpose of it. So the people were offering this, they were going to the temple, go to see the priest, and then they would give this meat to them to cook and then to share, just like Holy Communion. This is big Eucharist conversation stuff right here. And then they would go ahead and know that they are one with the Lord, if you will. Okay. And communion offering to the Lord, 22,000 oxen, oh, they counted them this time, and 120,000 sheep. I'm sure this is rounded numbers. Thus the king and all the Israelites dedicated the house of the Lord. On that day, the king consecrated the middle of the court facing the house of the Lord. He offered there the burnt offerings, grain offerings, and the fat of the communion offerings, because the bronze altar before the Lord was too small to hold the burnt offerings. The grain offering and the fat of the communion offering. There's so much that the grill that they would use, if you will, to do the offering was not large enough. On this occasion, Solomon and all Israel with him, a great assembly from these different places, celebrated the festival before the Lord our God for 7 days. That's another interesting aspect, isn't it? Because on the 8th day, he dismissed his people, he pledged the king and went to the tents. They all went to their tents, rejoicing and glad of heart because of all the blessings the Lord had given to David his servant and to his people Israel. So, they partied for 7 days and did a lot of barbecuing. No, it was actual offerings, of course, and doing this great celebration that there's now not just that they have a temple built, but they actually fulfilled what was in the making from the very time they even had the ark, and now the ark has a home. So that's what they finished celebrating. Okay, that pretty much concludes our class for this evening.